First of all, I want to echo David's call for expanding investment in criminological research. There's no more important decision about crime and justice for the long term that the federal government could make than to expand its commitment to a long-term intellectual development of a foundation for knowledge about crime and justice. That is speaking as president of the American Society of Criminology. So I'm going to talk about the consequences of what I have been referring to as a great experiment in the use of incarceration in the United States. I'm going to talk about the implications of this experiment. I'm going to summarize some of the literature about what we know its results to have been, and then I'm going to use that as a springboard for talking about justice reinvestment as a strategy for dealing with the problem of mass incarceration. We have had a growth in both the rate and the size of the prison population for over 30 years, and I'll show you a chart in a minute that will talk about that. In 1972, the first year that the prison population grew in our current streak of growth, there were about 200,000 prisoners. That was a rate of about 100 per 100,000. By this year, there are over 1.5 million prisoners. That's a rate of about 500 per 100,000. So there's been a quintupling of the size of the use of incarceration as a way of dealing with crime in the United States. We just heard about the Jeremy Travis's iron law of prisons. I want to talk about the iron law of prison populations, which is that the prison population is entirely produced by two numbers: how many people go in and how long they stay. And people go in one of two ways. They either go in because they're sentenced on a new crime, or they go in because after they were released on that crime, they are revoked from supervision after release, and they're returned to prison. This is a graph of the incarceration rate between the 1920s and today, and the crime rate. The pink line is the crime rate, and the blue line is the incarceration rate. What it will show you is that the crime rate started increasing. You can't see the years because the years are too small. The crime rate started increasing in the late 1950s and increased sharply for about a 25-year period to a peak in the early 1970s. But the incarceration rate did not start growing until the early 1970s. So there was about a 12-year gap between the growth of the crime rate and the growth of the incarceration rate. So one of the questions that's often asked is, what is the relationship between crime and incarceration? Well, one of them clearly is that as crime grows, later incarceration will grow. And what you see is that the crime rate fluctuated grew sharply for about 12 years into the early 1970s, fluctuated from the early 1970s until the early 1990s, and has dropped fairly significantly since the early 1990s. The incarceration rate started to grow in the 1970s, grew relatively slowly for the first 12 or 15 years, grew sharply in the late half of the 1980s, and has continued to grow throughout the 1990s into the 2000s, although growing at a less sharp rate. The crime rate today, with a 500% larger prison population, is almost identical to what it was in 1972 when the prison population began to grow. So I want to say to you that there is a relationship between incarceration and crime, but it is not this one. If the prison population grows, the crime rate will fall. I'm not going to summarize the literature on the relationship between incarceration and crime. There's a good literature out there, and if we want to talk about it in the Q&A, I'll be happy to summarize it. But I want to make this point. If you want to say the way to bring down crime is to bring up the prison population, you are not correct on the evidence. The incarceration rate has grown in concentrated ways. It has not spread evenly across the population or geography. It concentrates in gender and age. That is, the incarceration is concentrated among young men. 90% of the prisoners are men, and well over 1 million children currently have a parent incarcerated on any given day. It is also concentrated by ethnicity. African American males are 6 times more likely to be locked up than white males, and at current rates, 1/3 of all African American males will be locked up at some time. Of a male born today will be locked up at some time during that child's lifetime, and blacks are 10 times more likely to be in prison than in a labor union or on welfare. Incarceration also concentrates in place. In Cleveland and Baltimore neighborhoods, for example, 18% of the males, parenting age males, are locked up on any given day. in Brooklyn black neighborhoods. In the black neighborhoods of Brooklyn, the rate of going to prison or jail of adult males is about 12.4%. In white neighborhoods, it's about 2.7%. In Chicago, over half of the people returning to Chicago from prison system return to 7 neighborhoods. And in Tallahassee, in 2 neighborhoods, nearly every family has experienced at least one person being incarcerated within the last 5 years. This last point, we were doing a structured survey in 2 high incarceration neighborhoods in Tallahassee, interviewed over 100 people, and one of the questions on our survey, on our interview was, has a member of your family been locked up in the prison system within the last 5 years? 100% of the people who participated in that study answered that question yes, including a former mayor of Tallahassee, a black woman, the president of the Urban League, a black man, and the reverend of the AME Baptist Church on the Hill. This is a map geographically of the spatial constitution of incarceration in Brooklyn. What you'll see is wide swaths of Brooklyn have almost nobody going to prison. This is a 1-year incarceration rate. This is a block by block map. Wide swaths of Brooklyn have nobody going to incarceration, but as it concentrates in some parts of Brooklyn, and that if you looked at this map up close, you would see that there are a handful of blocks that have very high rates of people going to prison or jail in a single year. I'll come back to this map in a minute and talk about some of the implications. So there have been a lot of studies of this concentration of incarceration, both in terms of location and in terms of African American men in poor neighborhoods. I'm going to run through these. I'm not going to talk about any particular study in any detail. I'm going to run through them in a quick way, just to get a feel for the broad range of collateral consequences. Children born to somebody who's children of someone who goes to prison or jail have a higher rate of incidence of mental health, and they have a higher rate of incidence of problem behavior, including delinquency and later adult crime. Mental health includes depression and serious dysfunction as well. Families have higher rates of divorce. One of Bruce Western's statistics is interesting. An African-American man, 1 year after being released from prison, is as likely to be living with a woman with children as an African-American man who's never been to prison. He's 1/2 as likely to be married to that woman. So if you really don't like marriage as an institution, prison is your deal. The families also experience extraordinary broad range of fiscal and personal and social disruptions. And an ethnographic study is now being carried on women trying to maintain relationships with men who are incarcerated, and how that has stresses for families and for children and for their economic activity are very important. There's a series of studies showing that incarceration reduces the bond strength, not just between the child and the person who's incarcerated, but also between the child and the parent who remains home. There's also a reduction in the social support for the family of the person who has been incarcerated. One range of studies finds a broad range of health effects in high incarceration neighborhoods. This is an epidemiologist at University of North Carolina, Jim Thomas, and he finds, for example, that being a woman in a neighborhood that has high incarceration rates of men increases your chances of experiencing gonorrhea, syphilis, or chlamydia, and also HIV. But more importantly to me, because those are all treatable diseases, it also increases the chances of you experiencing a teenage birth. So if you're talking about the long-range consequences of high incarceration neighborhoods, you can look 15 years out and see what the implications for these neighborhoods of having higher rates of teenage children born to single parents. There is a broad range of economic activity. Just to illustrate, going to prison reduces the economic earnings of a man by 20%. If you have a neighborhood where everybody goes to prison, or all the men go to prison, this is a neighborhood in which the economic prospects have been systematically reduced collectively by 20%. It's a neighborhood where there's 20% less resources to spend on businesses, to spend on in the local economy, and so on. There's also a long-term impact on potential for labor market participation, and collectively the economic implications for neighborhoods and for poor people who go through the prison system and for their neighbors are substantial. There's also some very recent research showing that living in a neighborhood that has high incarceration rates reduces support for the legitimacy of the law, reduces support for the belief in the fairness of policing, some of the points we've already heard about. So when you add all this up, and in a chapter of my book, I call it Death by 1,000 Little Cuts, none of these individual effects is enormous, but they are additive. And so when you add them up, what you see is that the collective impact of incarceration concentrated among poor people who live in poor communities, especially African Americans, is all of the informal social controls that we expect to buttress us and support us so that we can reduce crime are in fact attenuated. This is a graph. What you'll see is that the two outside areas, deterrence and incapacitation at the top and reentry at the bottom, are the big system indicators that have something to do with incarceration rates. So the more people returning to a neighborhood from prison, the higher the crime rate in that prison, in that neighborhood. So we have a lot of people returning to certain neighborhoods, we increase their chances of experiencing crime. But all of the middle items in this graph are the informal social controls that incarceration itself destabilizes. So whatever the effect of incapacitation and deterrence is on reducing the crime rate, it is fighting against the tide of all of the collective effects of the high reentry rate and all of these other destabilizing effects on informal social controls that I've just summarized. This is a map of one neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. It's the Mission Hills, Lower Frenchtown neighborhood. And it's a dot on there for every person who was released from the prison system in 1996. There are 50 dots there. There's about 1,500 people live in that neighborhood. If you were to think about those 50 dots, you'd think about this one neighborhood in 1 year's experience of having to absorb 50 people in its already depleted resources from the Florida state prison system. But that is really not the story, because for every dot there of a person who's returning, there's a dot of a person who's being removed. So if you look at that picture and then visually in your head double the number of dots, you've actually got 1 year's activity. And then if you take that idea, if you take that visualization of doubling and then double it again, you've got 2 years of activity. And then if you double that again, you've got what a teenager experiences in that neighborhood, in the flow in and out of the prison system during his or her high school years. So what you have here is a ubiquitous, concentrated, powerful experience. In the, by the way, this is the neighborhood just north of Florida State University. It is the oldest African-American neighborhood in Leon County. It is the only place where blacks were allowed to buy property after emancipation. And it's the single most expensive, significant intervention in that neighborhood in terms of government dollars is the Florida State prison system. This is a graph. It's a little hard to read, so I'll explain it. This is a graph of the impact of that incarceration removal on crime rates. What you see if you follow the solid line, what you see is as the rate of people being removed and sent to prison increases, the rate of crime in the neighborhood in the following year decreases till it reaches a tipping point. And then it starts to increase. And so as you increase the concentration of incarceration interventions into a neighborhood, you decrease the capacity of that neighborhood to defend itself against crime past a certain point. And since the reentry effects on crime are additive and linear, that is, each new person who comes to the neighborhood represents an increase in the potential crime that next year in that neighborhood, you have a double whammy for these neighborhoods. They are not only having to absorb all the people returning from prison into their social capital, limited, already depleted social capital, but they're having to deal with the disruptions caused by all the people being removed that same year. So you ask the question, how can we have 500% more prisoners in 2009 than we had in 1972 and still have the same crime rate? That might be part of the answer. So what are we going to do about reducing incarceration? I want to emphasize to you that the prison system is, my iron law, the prison system is produced by the number of people who go in and how long they stay. And if you want to do something about the size of the incarceration rate, you have to do something about one or both of those numbers. So in other words, funding a drug treatment program is not likely to get you there. It's an important thing to do. I really believe in it, but it is not the solution to the problem of mass incarceration. If we reduce the length of stay in our sentenced prisoners, by the way, the graph I showed of the increasing use of incarceration divides, research has shown that you can divide that into 3 rough periods. In the first decade of the growth of incarceration, it was mostly due to increased crime rates. In the second decade, it was mostly due to increased probability of going to prison given you're committed of a crime. So for example, in 1972, one felon out of every 4 went to prison convicted of a crime. By 2009, 3 felons out of every 4 convicted of a crime go to prison. Most of that change occurred in the 1980s. The last third is length of stay. We have doubled length of stay since 1972, and most of that increase has occurred in the last 10 years. So we went back to the 1988 length of stay, average length of stay. If we diverted all technical probation and parole violators from prison, and we said if you're not arrested and convicted of a new crime, you can't be sent back to prison for your violation. We have to do something else with you. And if we eliminated all mandatory penalties for drug crimes, diverting all public order cases, in other words, we said the prison is restricted for felony offenses, non-drug felony offenses. This is what would happen. We would by the year 2017, we would be roughly back to the same incarceration level we had in 1988. We'd have a slow, in other words, by working on the how many people go in and how long they stay on both ends at the same time, over the next less than a decade, we would be back 20 years ago incarceration rates. And then we begin to see in these neighborhoods, we begin to see the incarceration rates start to drop below that tipping point that I pointed out, where incarceration becomes a part of the problem rather than a part of the solution. If we want to increase public safety, not just reduce incarceration rates, but increase public safety, what can we do? First of all, I want to suggest that this idea of justice reinvestment is an idea whose time has come. There's a lot of talk about it. It is defined as the focusing public safety dollars on community social control. That means is you take the money we are currently willing to spend on incarceration and move it, along with the people who are incarcerated, into the communities where those people live their lives. So, for example, in the state of New Jersey, an average year in prison is worth costs about $35,000. That person in the community would be worth $35,000. You can begin to imagine the kinds of programs that we've just heard about that could be mounted for $35,000 a year per person in Florida. I won't talk about some of the mechanisms that are used to move the person from the incarceration to the community, but the Council of State Governments has on its website about 12 interesting projects with 12 interesting strategies you might want to take a look at. What this does is to reorganize the incentives for social control. Currently, we do it this way. We say if you're a judge and you take a chance on a person and keep that person in the community and you mess up, the cost is yours. If you were smart, the benefits belong to somebody else. If you're a parole officer and a person is creating problems on your caseload, if you send that person to prison, if you keep that person in the community and it turns out that was a mistake, you experience the cost. But if you keep the person in the community and the person works out, someone else gets the benefits. If you send that person to prison, someone else pays the cost and you get the benefits. No business would open its doors in an environment where if it made money, someone else got the money, but if it incurred costs, it had to pay for it. No wonder the prison system has grown. The incentives are for it to grow. As let me say as an aside, the state of Arizona is just about ready to create an entire investment structure that will create an incentive for growing prison populations. So what the justice reinvestment idea is to produce a change in incentives. It is now worthwhile for a community to keep people in the community, to keep people who are, instead of sending them to prison, keep them in the community, because the money that would have gone to the prison system with them stays in the community with them. Imagine, for example, $35,000 spent on producing economic activity in a neighborhood, passing hands at least twice as $70,000 worth of wealth in a neighborhood where that kind of money doesn't exist very often. We can also use recidivism reduction programs to chip away at the margins of the incarceration rates of the people who are released. And finally, we can use that technique to produce a new homeostasis. I just want to say that what we've got in the United States now is a homeostasis that involves managing a lot of people in incarceration settings and then moving them back out in the community. So a lot of people go to prison, are watched for an average of about almost 3 years, and are sent back to the community. If we produce a new homeostasis where most people stayed in the community in the first place, a few people went to prison and stayed there for a short period of time and then went back to the community, that new homeostasis would produce about the same crime rate over time, but be much, much, much less expensive. This is prison and jail expenditures in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn map I showed you for that 1 year. There are individual blocks in there where $3 million is spent in a single year on a single block, locking up residents of that block. $3 million. Now, if you went to the residents of that block and said, we have $3 million for you, what would you like to do with it? They wouldn't say, lock up Joe for the rest of his life. They would say, we've got some ideas. And they might even be willing to take some portion of Joe in order to get that. But what we now do is, this is the takeaway one-liner, it is people who live on Park Avenue giving a lot of money to people who live in Attica, New York, to watch people who live in Brooklyn for a couple of years and send them back worse. That is the current deal. We can beat that deal, right? Justice reinvestment is the challenge to those communities to become a part of their own public safety agenda and a mechanism by which they can receive the resources in order to do that. And there's plenty of money. We don't need new money. We just need to reorganize the current money that we are spending on this problem. And how do you do that? Well, this is one of the precincts within within that map. And you can't see the little words here, but each one of those boxes is what is called a parochial social control in the literature. That is a community-based nonprofit organization that is being run by one of the residents of that neighborhood. These are all existing crime-fighting operations that could be our partners, that could be incentivized to work on the problem of public safety, and that could be resourced to work on the problem of public safety. The money is there, the people are there, the problem is there. The only question is our will. Thank you.